It started with nothing. A black woman, well-dressed, calm and composed, was standing outside a grocery store, waiting for a rideshare. She held her phone in one hand, keys in the other. That was all. 2 white officers in a patrol car rolled by. One looked at her, then at his partner. A silent exchange. They circled back. The first officer stepped out casually, fake smiling. "Ma'am, do you live around here?" She raised an eyebrow politely. "I'm just waiting for a ride." But that wasn't good enough. The questions got sharper. Accusatory. "Show ID." "What are you doing here?" "You look suspicious." Before she could answer again, the cuffs were out. Cold metal snapped onto her wrists. People stared, but stayed silent. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She said just one thing. "Call my husband." The officers laughed. One of them said, "Sure. Go ahead. Tell him we said hi." She didn't say another word, just calmly dialed the number. 2 hours later, the same officers would be suspended. By the end of the week, they'd lose their badges. Because her husband wasn't just anybody. He was Colonel David Ellis, commander of the 39th Military Police Brigade. And he wasn't coming to argue. He was coming to end careers. If this made your jaw drop, like to support stories that flip the script, comment what you would have done in her place. Share if you're tired of people getting away with this. And don't forget to subscribe for the next part, because this story's just getting started. Her name was Ava Robinson. To the officers who cuffed her outside the store, she was just another black woman with a nice handbag and a sharp tongue. Suspicious by default, threatening by existence. They didn't ask her job, didn't run her plates, didn't listen. They just made assumptions and mistakes. Ava wasn't loud. She didn't posture. But her silence had gravity. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. She was a cybersecurity operations analyst with the Department of Defense. Her job was classified. Her day-to-day consisted of reviewing threat maps, coordinating multi-agency response teams, and overseeing the defense protocols for government networks most people didn't know existed. But more than her job, it was her discipline that set her apart. She lived by structure, trained like she was still in service, and moved with a quiet presence that turned heads without ever demanding attention. Her morning routine was precise. 5 a.m. wake, 5:15 run, 6 o'clock cold shower, 6:30 review encrypted logs from overnight activity, 7:30 coffee plain, 8 o'clock work. That morning had been no different, except for the fact that she took a personal day to run errands and pick up groceries for the unit barbecue her husband's team was hosting that weekend. She wasn't supposed to be in that part of town, but traffic and a last-minute change in store inventory brought her to Jefferson Avenue. She parked. She picked up a few items. And then, while waiting for a rideshare, she checked her phone to verify pickup. That's when the officers pulled up. To the rest of the world, Ava was calm, unbothered, unshakable. But calm didn't mean powerless. The 2 patrol officers didn't know her name, only her skin, her posture, and their biases. So they followed a script written in fear and ego. One approached with the usual fake friendliness. "You lost?" "No," she said evenly. "You waiting for someone?" "Yes." "Mind telling us what you're doing out here?" "I just did." She could feel it then, the shift. Not in her, but in them. The discomfort, the confusion, the itch to assert control when logic failed. And when they asked for ID, Ava said, "Am I being detained?" And that was it. The first cop didn't answer, just reached for her wrist. She stepped back, reflexively. The second officer moved in, hand on the cuffs. Here's what they didn't know. Ava had spent 4 years in the Army, 2 tours overseas, 1 commendation for preventing a targeted cyber attack on a coalition base. She'd been handcuffed before in training, in field exercises, even in drills where resistance was simulated at full force. She knew how pain worked, how power moved, how fear disguised itself as authority. So she didn't flinch. She let them cuff her. She didn't scream or resist. She looked the first officer dead in the eyes and said, "Call my husband." He snorted. "Yeah? What's he gonna do?" At that exact moment, across the city in a secure military compound, Colonel David Robinson was reviewing satellite intelligence on troop logistics and cyber response scenarios. When Ava's call came through, silent but urgent, he stood up in the middle of the operations floor and said, "Clear the room." Now, 2 minutes later, he was patched into the precinct. 30 minutes after that, an unmarked black SUV pulled up outside the police station. Inside it sat a man in full dress uniform, accompanied by 2 military legal officers and 1 federal liaison. But let's go back. While Ava was in the back of the cruiser, calm as ever, the officers were cracking jokes. One of them said, "She'll be out by morning. Probably file a complaint." They always do. They didn't notice the call log on her phone. Didn't see the chain of alerts quietly hitting federal inboxes across agencies. They thought they had a win. Meanwhile, Ava remembered, not just her training, not just her husband's rank, but every moment in her life when someone like them had tried to reduce her to a stereotype. She thought of her mother, who told her at 15, "There will be days they see your skin before your words. Know who you are anyway." She thought of her commanding officer in Afghanistan, who said, "You want to survive this job? Don't wait for validation. Move like you belong, even if they don't know it yet." She thought of her first time briefing a room full of men who didn't think she belonged at the table, until she walked them through a threat matrix, so tight it became protocol. Ava didn't need to fight. She just needed to wait. 45 minutes later, the arresting officers were called to the precinct captain's office. They walked and relaxed, still joking. Then they saw who was waiting for them. Colonel Robinson. His voice was low, not angry, worse, measured. "You put hands on my wife." They stammered. "Sorry, we didn't know she was..." "A citizen? A professional? A human being?" Silence. He laid a file on the desk. Inside it, Ava's security clearance, military record, federal roll. Then another file. Footage from a civilian's phone. The whole encounter, from first approach to the cuffs. Then another. A formal complaint, signed by 3 witnesses who had stayed silent until they saw who she was married to. Then another. A letter from the Inspector General's office, ready to launch an internal misconduct investigation. Then finally, a single sentence. Effective immediately. Both officers are relieved of duty pending federal review. They tried to object. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "Careers don't end because of mistakes. They end because of patterns." Then he turned to the captain. "And your precinct's full of them." By the end of the week, both officers were suspended indefinitely. One resigned before the internal affairs interview. The other tried to file a counterclaim. It was thrown out in 48 hours. The body cam footage was quietly released to the public. The city issued a formal statement of apology. Ava refused a settlement. She wanted policy changes and got them. Ava Robinson had walked into thousands of rooms where people didn't expect her. Briefing rooms, server vaults, joint task force command centers. But few felt quite like this. It was 10 days after the incident. 10 days since she had been handcuffed without cause, paraded in front of strangers for the crime of waiting while black. 10 days since her husband, Colonel David Robinson, stepped into the precinct and dismantled the careers of the 2 men who tried to erase her dignity. Now she was walking into the same precinct again, but this time not as a victim. This time, she was walking in under federal orders. The Department of Defense had requested a meeting with the precinct leadership to review interagency communication protocols and discuss civil-military coordination. It was a formality on paper, but everyone in the building knew what it really was, a controlled reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on Ava. She didn't need revenge. She had the truth, and now she had leverage. She stepped through the lobby's metal detectors, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, badge clipped to her blazer. Her hair was tied back tight. No jewelry, no makeup, just presence. The receptionist stood up without being asked. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Reyes is expecting you." Upstairs in the conference room, the shift in energy was palpable. Everyone was standing. The captain, the internal affairs liaison, the interim PR officer, the 2 detectives who had tried, unsuccessfully, to bury the body cam footage. They were all quiet. And there in the corner, pretending to organize folders, was Officer Grant, one of the men who had handcuffed her. The same man who had chuckled when she said, "Call my husband." He looked up and locked eyes with her. His face turned pale. She didn't flinch. She just sat down. "Let's begin," Ava said. Flashback. 10 days earlier, in that very same room, Officer Grant had stood with his booted foot tapped lazily against a chair leg, smirking as he told his partner. "She pulled my husband's military card. I say, we let her make the call and then go write it up. They didn't file the report correctly. They didn't know her name until 2 hours later, when command showed up. When they realized they had humiliated a senior intelligence asset married to a U.S. Army commander." Back in the room now, Ava flipped open her case file. "Before we get into the policy review, I'd like to speak to the pattern of behavior observed not just during my arrest, but in dozens of similar encounters reported over the last 12 months. She handed out packets, compiled data, witness statements, footage clips, complaint logs. Cross-referenced. Time-stamped. Silence. She continued, "This isn't about me. I just happen to be the one who called the right person." The precinct captain tried to interject. "Ms. Robinson, we recognize." She raised a hand, polite but firm. "I wasn't finished." Every word she spoke was measured, cool, and heavy. She cited the department's failure to retrain after multiple racial profiling complaints. She pointed to a 2019 study on unconscious bias in traffic stops, ignored by local leadership. She called out the disciplinary loopholes that allowed serial offenders to hop precincts without consequence. She wasn't speaking as a victim. She was presenting like a military strategist, with facts, patterns, and a paper trail. After 40 minutes, she paused, then turned to Officer Grant. "Would you like to comment?" He squirmed. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "You mean the cuffs, the jokes, or the arrest without cause?" "Look, I didn't know who you were." "Exactly," she said. "That's the problem." Across town, Colonel David Robinson was receiving hourly updates. He'd seen the files, heard the recordings, and watched his wife do what she always did: deconstruct power without ever raising her voice. He didn't need to be there. Ava had it handled, but he was on standby. Meanwhile, word had gotten out. Not in press conferences, Ava had refused interviews, but through whispers, officers in nearby precincts started reviewing their own procedures. Junior recruits began requesting transfer papers away from known hotbeds of abuse. The fallout was systemic, because what Ava had done wasn't just about justice. It was about professional consequences, accountability, institutional memory. Back in the room, the precinct's PR officer broke the silence. "Ms. Robinson, would you be open to consulting with us as we revise our protocol manual?" Ava gave a small nod. "That depends. Are you looking for consultation or a headline?" The officer looked away. "We're looking for change." She studied him for a moment, then said, "Then let's start by acknowledging what happened. On paper. Not just to me, but to everyone who didn't have a colonel to call." The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't silence out of fear. It was recognition. As the meeting adjourned, Ava stood and gathered her files. Officer Grant, still seated, opened his mouth slightly. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," Ava said without looking back. "You just didn't think it would cost you." And then she walked out. 3 weeks after the arrest, the moment everyone tried to downplay came back, not in silence, but in full daylight, and this time on record. It began with a memo, one that shouldn't have leaked, but it did. The document, drafted internally by a precinct sergeant, tried to explain away Ava Robinson's arrest with a phrase that would become infamous across the department: situational compliance necessary to avoid escalation, given perceived behavioral tension. That one sentence lit a match under everything, because it wasn't just false, it was dangerous. Ava received the memo through an anonymous source inside the department. She read it 3 times, not because she was surprised, but because the lie was so methodical, so polished, it almost sounded reasonable. But she knew better. She had lived it. In the memo, the officers claimed she was physically evasive, that she refused to identify herself. That verbal tone matched indicators of agitation. What it didn't mention was the body cam footage, or the civilian cell phone video, or the GPS timestamp from her phone proving she was standing still and waiting for a lift. This memo crossed a line, because up until then, Ava had treated the incident as a personal assault wrapped in systemic patterns. She hadn't sought the spotlight. She'd avoided press. She focused on institutional fixes and procedural reform. But this memo? This was an active attempt to rewrite the story. Not just hers, everyone's. She printed the memo, highlighted the lies in red, and sent a copy to the DOJ Civil Rights Division, her husband's commanding general, 2 national watchdog groups, a friend at a major investigative news outlet. Within 48 hours, it was published online. By Monday morning, it was national news. The media dubbed it the Robinson retraction. The department scrambled to issue a statement calling the memo unofficial. But no one bought it, especially since it had been drafted on a precinct letterhead and circulated internally. Ava remained silent for 3 days. Then she agreed to one interview. Just one. Live on camera, seated in a minimalist studio. She spoke clearly, precisely, and without emotional theatrics. This was never just about me. It was about the assumptions people carry, and the power those assumptions are given. The interviewer leaned in. What do you want now? Ava didn't hesitate. I want the truth to be louder than the lie, and I want those who lie under the cover of a badge to lose the privilege to wear one. The fallout was immediate. 3 internal affairs investigations were reopened. The precinct's captain was placed on administrative leave. Officer Grant was formally terminated. The sergeant who wrote the memo resigned under pressure. But the line had already been crossed. Now it was about how far she would go. Meanwhile, in the background, Ava had started building something. A quiet coalition of legal advisors, data analysts, former officers, and civil rights attorneys. They weren't chasing headlines. They were building a case, using patterns from over 120 complaints filed over the past 5 years. Ava's team uncovered a systematic trail of misfiled reports, edited body cam footage, tampered incident logs, settlements with NDAs attached. The picture that formed was clear. Ava's arrest wasn't an anomaly. It was the rule. She just happened to be the wrong person for them to follow the rule with. Colonel Robinson watched it all unfold with strategic calm. He didn't push Ava one way or another. He didn't need to. He had known from the moment he saw her in cuffs that the real retaliation wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from the quiet, unflinching strategy of a woman who never needed to raise her voice to destroy your foundation. The turning point came during a public forum hosted by the mayor's office. The room was full: press, city officials, police reps, and local citizens. Ava stood up from the 3rd row when the moderator asked if anyone wished to speak. No podium, no microphone, just her. There's a phrase they use in training, she said. Officer discretion. They say it like it's neutral, like it's wise. But when discretion is guided by fear and bias, it becomes a weapon. One that doesn't fire bullets, but assumptions. Assumptions that can kill careers. Assumptions that can end lives. She paused. And I'm here to say it ends now. The room was dead silent. Then the first applause. Then more. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. The precinct rep lowered his eyes. Because they all knew this wasn't a speech. This was a declaration. The echo from Ava's statement at the mayor's forum hadn't faded before something else detonated, quietly, but with devastating accuracy. It came from the inside. A single phrase, recorded and nearly forgotten, surfaced from one of the officers' body cams. The line itself wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even meant to be heard beyond the squad car. But once it was replayed, transcribed, and leaked, it would shift the entire public tide. Because what Officer Grant had said was simple. Too simple. But it revealed everything. On the morning of the arrest, right before Ava had been handcuffed, right before the situation escalated, his mic was still hot. He was speaking to his partner as they approached Ava outside the store. And he said, "She's got that attitude, you know the type. Let's get ahead of it before it turns into something." That was it. But that was enough. The phrase, "you know the type," hit like shrapnel in the public consciousness. It wasn't just racial profiling. It was preemptive criminalization based on race, posture, and assumption. He didn't say, "Let's see what's going on." He didn't say, "Let's ask questions." He said, "Let's get ahead of it." That alone revealed intent, not to protect, but to control, to dominate. The audio was sent to Ava anonymously, along with the full body cam footage from the minutes before her arrest. A small note was attached. Internal audio, not scrubbed, for your records. A friend. Ava didn't watch it in anger. She watched it in confirmation. This wasn't about an isolated action. It was about a mindset. She played it for her husband later that evening. Colonel David Robinson listened, jaw set, expression hardening. "You're going to make this public?" he asked. She nodded. "Not me. Someone else." By morning, the audio had leaked. Again, Ava didn't hold a press conference. She didn't need to. The public did it for her. Every news channel played the clip. Social media dissected it. Analysts broke it down. Former officers came forward, confirming how often that phrase, "you know the type," was code. Not for justice, but for targeting. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a confession, and it couldn't be denied. The city's Office of Public Accountability launched an emergency hearing. This time, Ava didn't walk in alone. She was joined by 3 legal advisors, 2 data analysts, and a representative from the Civil Liberties Commission. They weren't there to testify. They were there to present. The audio was played in a packed room. You could hear a pin drop. Then Ava stood up. No paper in hand. No speech written. Just truth. What he said wasn't new. It was just recorded. And now that it is, the question isn't whether it happened. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The committee chairman shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Robinson, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting," she interrupted, calm and clear. "I'm submitting." She nodded toward her team, who distributed printed transcripts, time-stamped audio logs, and supporting complaint data, all tracking usage of similar language in officer reports across the precinct. There was no more room for denial, no more space for spin. The collapse had started, and now the reckoning had a soundtrack. Outside the hearing, protesters held signs with the words, "You know the type." It became a rally cry. It went viral. Even some police reform advocates, previously hesitant to side with Ava's case, admitted the line crossed a threshold they could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, inside the department, officers were split. Some distanced themselves from Grant and his partner, quietly disgusted. Others doubled down, defending their own use of similar language as colloquial and contextual. But the damage was done. Ava never lost control of the narrative, because she never tried to own it. She let the truth speak for itself. She didn't demand apology. She built accountability. Colonel Robinson stayed in the background, watching Ava's restraint turn into momentum. He knew this part of her well, the part that never raised her voice, but always raised the standard. One evening over dinner, he asked, "If it were up to you, what happens next?" Ava looked up, steady. "I don't want them fired. No, I want them retrained under someone like me. I want them to see the system from the other side of the badge. Then if they fail, I want them gone." Her husband smiled, a hard smile, proud. "That's going to take the kind of reform people fight." "Good," she said. "Let them." If the leaked audio cracked the foundation, the evidence that came next shattered it. Ava Robinson knew that a single quote, no matter how damning, could be spun, misinterpreted, or buried under bureaucratic nuance. But evidence? Hard, layered, inarguable facts? That was different. That was justice with teeth. And Ava hadn't just hoped for it. She had built it. Quietly, deliberately, and now fully. Weeks earlier, while city officials still tried to move on from the controversy, Ava had been assembling a private, off-the-record investigative team. Not activists, not PR strategists, analysts, former auditors, civilian compliance officers, people who knew systems, people who had survived them. They'd gone through 5 years' worth of precinct data, not just reports, but patterns, stop and frisk records, complaint logs, disciplinary filings, internal memos, body cam metadata, traffic citation discrepancies. They found what Ava knew would be there, but hoped she was wrong about. Over 60 officers from the department had used the phrase, "you know the type," or variations of it in written and verbal reports. In each case, the subject was black. In 0 cases did the phrase appear in interactions with white civilians. Even more damning, 34% of those encounters led to arrests that were either dropped, dismissed, or resulted in no formal charge. That was the statistical bombshell. But Ava wasn't done. She had something bigger, and it came from someone unexpected. A former precinct officer named Sergeant Darnell Hughes, a black man who had worked under the same captain for over a decade, reached out to Ava after her forum appearance. He wasn't bitter. He was tired. He brought with him a private USB drive, documents he had quietly saved over the years, hoping someone would one day listen. The contents included internal communications where officers joked about the look that meant they should run ID on site, photos of a whiteboard from a shift briefing where a target neighborhood was circled in red ink, 85% black population, an email chain in which a superior dismissed a racial profiling complaint by writing. They always play the card. Let it go. But the most devastating file was a training slide deck from 2020. One slide stood out. Pre-incident behavior. Look for indicators. Agitated movement. Refusal to make eye contact, appearing nervous. Hoodie up, loitering near storefronts. Each behavior had a photo beside it. Every photo, black men and women. Ava didn't release the files all at once. She gave them to the Department of Justice. She let the feds come in quietly. She let them ask questions. Then, when the city tried to go public with their own sanitized statement, she leaked the original files. The media had never seen anything so cleanly damning. Not since body cams became mandatory. Not since protests forced departments to admit patterns. Every major outlet ran a variation of the same headline. System failure. Internal files reveal racial targeting in Jefferson Precinct. The city was on fire, not with violence, but with truth. Council meetings overflowed. Community forums filled auditoriums. Students walked out of schools in silent protest, holding signs with the quote, "They always play the card." Ava didn't gloat. She barely spoke publicly. Instead, she testified again, this time in front of a joint city federal oversight board. Her voice was calm, but her language was surgical. You want to say this isn't about race? Explain to me why your own training slides only show one kind of face, one kind of body, one kind of threat. She dropped the clicker. The screen shifted behind her. Dozens of complaint documents filled the room. Redacted names, repeated phrases. Explain to me why 78% of preemptive detainments never led to charges, but 93% involved black civilians. She let that sit. Explain to me why I'm supposed to trust a badge that's taught to see me as a problem before I open my mouth. The room stayed silent for nearly a minute. Then one official, a former city prosecutor, said, "This may be the most thorough evidence package we've ever seen from a civilian." Ava replied without flinching, "I'm not a civilian. I'm a systems analyst trained by the U.S. government to detect failure. And right now the failure is you." Behind the scenes, Colonel Robinson was coordinating with military liaisons and federal observers, not to protect Ava, but to support her reach. Her work was becoming a case study. Federal compliance officers began replicating her model in other cities. One D.C. analyst called it the Robinson Protocol, quiet evidence with loud consequences. Meanwhile, Officer Grant tried to save himself with a public statement. He called the memo a miscommunication. He said his body cam quote was taken out of context. He blamed the stress of the job. The public didn't buy it. He was stripped of certification, blacklisted from serving in any law enforcement body in the state, forced to surrender his pension pending lawsuit outcomes. The other officer involved? He left town. But Ava didn't stop at 2 men. She kept going. Because evidence, once activated, doesn't just punish. It forces change. By the end of the quarter, the Jefferson Precinct had a new interim chief, 23 officers suspended or under review, mandatory third-party bias training, a citizen-elected oversight board with subpoena power. And Ava? She turned down every speaking engagement. Instead, she wrote a white paper, quietly published, widely shared. Title: Predictive Threat Bias in Civil Policing, Patterns, Language, and Prevention. In the final paragraph, she wrote, "Bias doesn't live in intent. It lives in systems that allow it to function. And systems only change when someone shows what they're made of in full, unedited, timestamped truth. No institution lets go of control quietly, especially not one that spent decades wielding it unchecked." Ava Robinson's rise from detained to dangerous was a threat, not just to 2 disgraced officers, but to a culture of silent protection, sealed documents, and unspoken codes. Her evidence hit like a scalpel not a bomb, slicing open systems and exposing nerves the city had spent years covering. And now they were coming for her. It started with a news segment. Local station, prime time, subtle at first. A former precinct insider hinted that Ava's data may have been illegally obtained. No name was given. No facts confirmed. Just a seed planted. The next day, a second piece dropped. A short editorial questioning Ava's motives. Should civilians with military ties be allowed to influence local police reform? It didn't accuse. It suggested. 2 days later, an anonymous tip claimed that Ava had used her DoD access to retrieve internal law enforcement records. A federal violation if true. Within hours, blogs and lower-tier networks jumped on it. Ava Robinson, the whistleblower, the system analyst, the survivor, was now being painted as a security threat. The irony wasn't lost on her. She sat at her kitchen table, reading headlines on a second-hand tablet. "They're not coming after the data," she murmured. "They're coming after the credibility." Across from her, Colonel David Robinson stood with his arms crossed. "They want to push you into a reactive posture. Get you rattled. That won't work. They're counting on noise, misdirection, confusion. I'm counting on documentation." But Ava wasn't naive. She knew how these things spread. One whisper turns into a debate. A debate becomes an investigation. And an investigation, even without conviction, becomes doubt. And doubt was a cancer. That afternoon, Ava received an email from a federal compliance officer she had worked with on early reform proposals. "Just a heads up. There's movement to audit your access logs." Internal Affairs from the DOJ Cyber Division was briefed this morning. Unofficial, but it's happening. Ava leaned back in her chair, breathed once, and smiled. The attack wasn't just public. It was legal. Subpoenas followed. Freedom of information requests for her communications. Threats of perjury charges if any document she submitted was found doctored or modified. Even her time in the military was quietly questioned. A reporter from a fringe outlet filed a request for her discharge papers, looking for anything dishonorable. But Ava had built her case like she had lived her life. Impossible to shake. Every document she released was backed up. Every timestamp verified. Every testimony pre-cleared. Every body cam clip authenticated by third-party chains of custody. Still, the pressure mounted. Sponsors pulled out from forums she was scheduled to speak at. One nonprofit paused a research grant she'd been tapped to lead. A columnist called her aggressively technical writing. Ms. Robinson may be too cerebral and not empathetic enough to lead public healing. That was the phrase that made her laugh. Too cerebral. What they really meant was, she made us look sloppy. And she didn't smile while doing it. Despite it all, Ava remained grounded. Not calm, calculated. She had seen worse. Overseas in uniform. In server rooms post-breach. In policy rooms where 5-star generals waited for her green light on protocol. But this wasn't about code or firewalls. This was about perception. So Ava made her move. She recorded a statement, not a rant. 3 minutes. One take. Posted with no edits, no filter. The lighting was natural. She didn't wear a suit. Just a plain t-shirt and her wedding band. She looked into the camera. "I've been accused of overstepping, of being too methodical, of pulling data that embarrassed people in power. What they don't say is that every number I've published was already in their systems. They don't say that what they call a leak was a record they buried. I didn't hack anything. I didn't steal anything. I read what they didn't think anyone would read, and I remembered it. Now they're scared, and they should be." The video hit 1.2 million views in 48 hours. More importantly, it got attention from the right people. Within the week, a senior federal judge ordered a protective injunction around Ava's submitted records. The DOJ released a statement clarifying Ava Robinson was not under investigation. And finally, a quiet memo leaked, this time in Ava's favor. From inside the same department that had started the audit. Her chain of custody documentation is airtight. Recommend no further action. But the attacks didn't stop. They just changed shape. Ava's mother's home address was posted online. So was a partial license plate of Ava's car. A concerned citizen sent an email to Ava's employer claiming she was mentally unstable, citing radical behavior. Even her husband was approached off base by a man posing as press, asking, Does it ever bother you that your wife gets more attention than you? David didn't reply. He just stared him down until the man walked away. At night, Ava stayed up later. Not afraid, just tightening everything. Rechecking files. Encrypting backups. Coordinating with her lawyer and team. Her house became a war room. Not with red strings and conspiracy boards, but with clean timelines, clear facts, bulletproof chains. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was preparing for the next move. Her mentor, a retired general-turned-ethics consultant, called her one evening. I watched the smear campaign. They're trying the old playbook. It's a loud one, Ava said. That means you're winning. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. They're not fighting you because you were wrong. They're fighting you because you're effective. And the public? The public was watching. When the precinct attempted to hold a press conference announcing a pause on Ava's recommended policy shifts, the crowd outside chanted her name, not in praise, in pressure. Because now the people knew. The system doesn't strike back unless it's afraid. The unraveling didn't start with a confession. It started with a clerical error. A junior administrative staffer at the department's public relations office, 26, overworked, underpaid, attached the wrong file to an internal do not disclose memo. That file, instead of the PR-approved response package, contained a raw document titled Internal Risk Assessment, Officer Profile Cluster Metrics, Q3 Review. It was supposed to be seen by 6 people. It ended up in the inbox of 26, including 3 individuals on Ava Robinson's civilian oversight team. What it revealed wasn't a list of infractions. It was worse. It was a scorecard, a quiet, unofficial evaluation rubric that measured officers on metrics like proactive engagement, command presence, and response dominance. Each metric was coded, and when the codes were decoded by Ava's team, they painted a picture that stopped everyone cold. The language sounded neutral, until you read between the lines. Proactive engagement equals frequency of initiating contact without dispatch calls. Command presence equals number of detainments where compliance was achieved before Miranda. Response dominance equals documented willingness to override civilian refusal. It wasn't just biased. It was engineered for abuse. More disturbing, officers with higher scores on this unofficial scale were statistically less likely to face internal review and more likely to be fast-tracked for promotions into supervisory roles. The pattern was undeniable. The more aggressively you played the system, the further you advanced in it. Ava read the file 3 times. No anger. No shock. Just clarity. She turned to her team. It's not the bad apples. It's the tree. The unraveling gained momentum from there. And now it wasn't just Ava pulling the thread. A city clerk came forward anonymously and released a batch of non-disclosure agreements tied to excessive force settlements. There were 32 of them in the last 2 years alone. Names redacted, amounts listed, all marked resolved without admission of fault. The same officers appeared again and again. Some had been promoted. A data analyst inside the mayor's office, who had helped bury budget allocations to internal affairs, leaked a spreadsheet. It showed how much of the city's law enforcement funding had been rerouted into liability reserves. In plain English, they were budgeting for brutality. The press couldn't spin it. No one could. And the public? They didn't need speeches. They had the receipts. Marches resumed, not in anger, but with purpose. Silent, disciplined, organized. People held up Ava's white paper in protest. They quoted her hearings. They wore T-shirts that read, not the apple, the tree. The city council called an emergency session. Ava was invited to speak. This time she brought everything. Not just statistics, but names, incidents, timestamps, eyewitness accounts, body cam freeze frames. She didn't make accusations. She made a map, a top-down illustration of how the system protected itself, how it punished silence and rewarded escalation. She spoke slowly. Each slide hit harder than the last. She ended with one sentence. If you defend this, it's not ignorance anymore. It's alliance. The silence that followed wasn't just discomfort. It was complicity breaking. One council member resigned that night. 3 others issued public apologies and withdrew their votes from the precinct expansion bill. Then came the avalanche. The police union president stepped down. The captain of the Jefferson precinct was placed on administrative leave. The governor announced a state review of all local law enforcement metrics. Internal affairs was handed over to an independent civilian board for the first time in city history. And Ava? She didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She got on a plane. Destination, an undisclosed city, to help another department map their own tree. But back in Jefferson, the air had changed. Not because people were cheering, but because they were watching now. Eyes open, questions sharp. And the old guard? They felt it. For the first time, they were the ones being surveilled. 2 weeks later, Ava received a message. Simple. From a number she didn't recognize. I was one of the people in that training session. I didn't speak then, but I'm speaking now. Attached, a scanned handout from a 2017 Command Tactics seminar. At the bottom, handwritten in blue pen. Score high. Don't hesitate. Command is watching. The paper was real, and it had fingerprints. The collapse didn't come with explosions. It came with signatures. It came with resignations typed in courier font, printed on government letterhead, slid across polished desks in silent, grim surrender. And it began with one name, Ava Robinson. For months, the system had pushed back through media manipulation, legal loopholes, institutional noise. But evidence, when compiled with precision and released like a tide, doesn't make a bang. It erodes. It washes everything away. On a cold Monday morning, the Jefferson Police Department's website quietly changed. At the top, where the command staff were once proudly listed with full-color photos and credentials, the screen now showed, under reorganization, interim leadership in effect, 14 officers, 5 through forced resignation, 3 via early retirement, 2 stripped of badges by emergency review for under federal indictment. Among them, Captain Morelli, the one who signed off on Ava's detainment report without reviewing the body cam footage. The same man who greenlit the memo blaming her noncompliance. He didn't go with a fight. He went in silence, because the federal charges tied to obstruction of justice left him no room to talk. The Police Oversight Commission, once powerless and symbolic, now had teeth. Subpoena power, budgetary review access, hiring and termination veto rights. And on its newly formed civilian board, Ava Robinson's name, not as chair, not as a figurehead, but as lead analyst, the person responsible for breaking down every precinct policy, every arrest trend, every internal loophole. The same systems that failed her were now required to answer to her. Some people said it was too much, too fast, too personal. Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. The data did it for her. In the first 6 weeks after the restructuring, civilian complaints dropped by 42%. Unwarranted stops fell by 61%. Body cam malfunctions declined by 88%. And for the first time in 8 years, not a single excessive force complaint made it past preliminary review. Meanwhile, new policies were rolled out. Officers could no longer initiate contact based on subjective pre-incident behavior. Every stop required a written justification filed before detainment. All training materials were rewritten, reviewed, and made public. A new rule required every precinct to submit monthly bias audit logs, to be analyzed by Ava's team. And if any of it was late, incomplete, or suspicious, funding froze. That was Ava's clause. It wasn't vengeance. It was design. Because collapse doesn't mean chaos. Collapse in Ava's hands meant restructure. The city tried to offer her a medal. She declined. They offered ceremony. She refused. Instead, she sent a one-line statement. Fix what you tried to deny. Still, the city needed to show change. So they did something else. They installed a plaque in front of the Jefferson precinct, where it all began. The same sidewalk where Ava had been handcuffed without reason, where she had stood silent, staring into a system that thought it knew her. The plaque read, dedicated to the citizens whose silence spoke louder than fear, and to those who refused to stay silent. No mention of her name. That was how she wanted it. But people knew. The public knew. The officers knew. Some fought it, grumbled behind closed doors, called it overreach, whispered about a witch hunt. Those voices faded, because as the months passed, one thing became undeniable. The city worked better. Not perfect, not utopian, but safer, fairer, clearer. Ava didn't take interviews, but others did. A public defender once opposed to her method said, "I thought she was too calculated. I was wrong. We needed someone who knew how to dismantle a weaponized system with surgical precision." A former officer who resigned in protest later said, "She didn't come to destroy us. She came to remind us what we swore to protect." And the most unexpected voice of all? Grant, the officer who first cuffed her. In a taped deposition related to the federal indictment against the precinct, he said, "I thought I knew the job. I didn't. She did. She didn't scream, didn't threaten. She just held up a mirror. I couldn't look away." The collapse didn't stop at Jefferson. Across the state, cities requested Ava's audit protocols. 3 departments adopted her white paper as a baseline for reform. And quietly, in D.C., 2 senators added language to a draft bill on national police accountability standards, referencing community-driven analytical oversight, citing her model. She never asked for credit, but her fingerprints were everywhere. In her office, Ava kept one thing on the wall: the original complaint form she filed after her arrest, now yellowed at the corners, but still sharp in ink. At the bottom, under desired outcome, she had written, "Systematic transparency, not revenge." Colonel Robinson asked her once, "Would you do it all again?" Ava didn't hesitate. "Yes, but faster next time." Ava Robinson never asked for apologies. She didn't wait for them, didn't expect them. She knew too much about how systems worked and how people hid inside them to believe everyone would one day see clearly. But reckoning? Reckoning always comes, and not with noise, not with fists, but with return. It started on a Tuesday. Ava was walking out of a quiet meeting with the city's new oversight committee. No press, no fanfare, just a closed-door review of training protocols she had helped design. A young man in a faded hoodie approached her in the hallway. He didn't speak at first. She recognized him. It took a second. He had been there that day, outside the store. One of the bystanders. The one who filmed the arrest but didn't intervene. He held his phone like a shield, like it was enough. Now he looked older. Not in age, in weight. The kind that settles in people who know they stood too still when someone else was standing alone. He said quietly, "I should have done more." Ava didn't blink. "You recorded. That helped. I could have spoken. Would they have listened?" He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either. That night, a note was left at the precinct's old memorial wall. Just a folded slip of paper taped under the new plaque. A single sentence in clean handwriting. "I stood on the curb and watched. You stood inside the cuffs. I'm sorry." No name, no camera, just truth. That was the first reckoning. A week later, Ava visited a community center on the south side, a quiet part of the city where trust in institutions had long since gone cold. She was speaking with a group of students when a familiar voice broke through the crowd. "Do you remember me?" It was a former teacher, one of the ones who used to praise quiet strength in the classroom, but never spoke up when Ava was pulled into detentions she didn't earn or searched while others weren't. "I didn't say anything back then," the woman said. "I convinced myself it wasn't my place." Ava gave a small nod. "A lot of people did. I wasn't brave. Neither was I. Not until I had no choice." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But the silence between them felt cleaner somehow. In the following weeks, more moments came. Not apologies. Exactly. Reflections. Admissions. The beginnings of understanding. The man who used to sit on the neighborhood watch board and once called Ava's presence on his street unfamiliar dropped off a letter. In it he wrote, "I told my son you were out of line. Now he's writing a paper about you. I was wrong. He sees more clearly than I did." The reckoning didn't look like punishment. It looked like recognition. The quiet kind. Even inside the department, some who had stood silent came forward, not in grand gestures, but in small acts. One officer, still employed but transferred out of Jefferson, mailed Ava his original training packet with a yellow sticky note on page 3. "This is where they first taught me how to profile. I'm still unlearning it. Another emailed her a line from her own testimony. If you defend this, it's not ignorance anymore. It's alliance. And he added, thank you for showing me I was aligned with the wrong side. Ava kept these notes in a box, not for pride, not for validation, but to remind herself, reckoning isn't always an explosion. Sometimes it's a door creaking open. Then came one she didn't expect. A voicemail from Officer Grant. His voice was unsteady, like it hurt to speak. I know I've got no place calling you. I've been in counseling since the case closed. Mandatory, but I kept going. I watched your hearing. The part where you said, if they fail, I want them gone. I failed. I was gone. I know that's justice. But what you built after, that's more than justice. That's structure. I see it now. You didn't just survive what we did. You organized the world after it. And I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to say, I finally see it. He ended with, thank you. I mean that. Ava didn't reply, but she saved the voicemail. Not because she forgave him, but because that, too, was a form of documentation. One afternoon, Ava was visiting a nearby school to help with a civic curriculum pilot. In a hallway lined with art, a student, maybe 11, maybe 12, ran up to her holding a printed news article. That's you, right? Ava smiled, slightly wary. Depends what it says. The girl flipped the paper over and pointed to a quote. Not the apple, the tree. My teacher says we're learning about systems, she said. I didn't know grown-ups could fix them. Ava crouched to meet her eyes. We can, but it takes work. Hard work. Sometimes slow work, but it lasts longer. That evening, Ava walked the same sidewalk she had been cuffed on. No escort, no cameras, just her alone. She paused where it happened, where they had stood, where no one moved, where she had said, call my husband, not as a plea, but as a warning. And now, there were flowers near the memorial. A note in a child's handwriting. Dear Ms. Ava, my mom says you helped the city. I want to do that too. She didn't cry, but she stood still for a long time. Because reckoning isn't the moment someone says sorry. It's a moment they no longer pretend they were right. The office was quiet. No phones rang. No clicking of keys. Just a soft hum of filtered air and the faint echo of Ava Robinson's footsteps as she moved through the space for the last time. The oversight board had voted unanimously. The protocols were in place. The reforms had been codified, embedded into city policy. The final audit cycle was complete. Ava's work in Jefferson was finished. But this walk through the halls she helped design, past the glass walls she insisted remained transparent, through the rooms where silence had been transformed into structure. This was the moment that mattered. Not because it was grand, but because it was hers. She opened the drawer of the small desk that had been hers for the past year and a half. No clutter, no decoration, just a locked case inside, which she keyed open with a practiced motion. Inside was her original complaint form, still intact, still raw. Next to it, a thumb drive with encrypted backups of the body cam footage, civilian testimonials, and the white paper that had set it all in motion. She placed the complaint inside the case and closed it, locking it again. She didn't need the documents anymore. The truth had already rewritten the policy manual. She stood, took one last look around, and left the key on the desk. A small folded note beside it read, if this ever starts to slide again, reopen everything. No permission needed. Signed, AR. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, a few reporters were waiting across the street. They didn't call to her. They knew by now not to. She didn't give interviews. She never did. She just walked, not rushed, not avoiding, just forward. She took the long route home, down Jefferson Avenue, past the grocery store where it all began. The storefront had changed. Different sign, new paint. But she knew the exact spot on the sidewalk where her wrist had first been twisted. She paused there just briefly, not to relive it, but to recognize it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Robinson. Dinner waiting. Don't make me reheat it twice. Love you. She smiled, tucked the phone away. A block later, she passed a young black girl walking with her mother. The girl looked up, blinked, then whispered something. The mother turned, saw Ava, and gave a nod. One of those quiet gestures that carried the weight of history. Ava returned it, then kept walking. No one recognized her at the next intersection. No one stopped her. No one asked for quotes, or retweets, or panels, or podcasts. She didn't need to be known. She needed the work to remain. Later that evening, she sat with David at their kitchen table. No files, no charts, just leftovers, 2 glasses of wine, and the first shared silence in weeks that didn't feel heavy. He raised a glass to a city that almost broke, and a woman who bent it back. She clinked her glass with his, to a system that thinks it's permanent, and the people who remind it it's not. They didn't say much more after that. They didn't need to. That night, Ava walked alone into the small side room where she kept her personal archive. 1 bookshelf, 1 locked cabinet, 1 framed newspaper clipping. Not hung, just resting, leaning. The headline read, "The system blinked." She didn't. Underneath, in small type, Ava Robinson declines comment. Again, she sat down. No pen, no laptop, just her thoughts. This wasn't a victory lap. This was a close. And Ava believed in closes. Because when something ends well, not flashy, not explosive, just finished. That's how something new gets to begin. She remembered her mother's voice. "They'll never give you the whole room, baby. Just corners. Make the corners count." She had. Next morning, Ava packed a single bag. Not for vacation, for a flight. The state of New Hampshire had requested her input. Another city, another pattern, another system that thought it had covered its tracks. She didn't want to go, but she was the kind of woman who did what needed doing. Before she left, she returned to the memorial. Not the official one, but the spot, the exact spot. She stood on the same square of sidewalk where the cuffs had clicked shut around her wrists. Same concrete, different air. And she said, softly, not for anyone to hear, "You tried to erase me. But what I built didn't need your permission to last." She knelt, placed a folded piece of paper beneath the new flower pot someone had left. The note read, "The end isn't justice. The end is when the truth outlives the lie." And then she walked away. Not every ending comes with applause. Some just come with silence, and no one needing to explain anything anymore. Thank you for reading this full arc. Comment if you've ever stood alone and walked out stronger. Like if you believe real legacy lives in policy, not praise.